Art and Technology Committee, which is the committee that is presenting this talk tonight. We want to welcome you to the National Arts Club. I'm Dave Ford. I'm the co-chair, and I work with Rob Griffiths, who is running around here somewhere in the back. He is also the co-chair, and we've been able to curate and bring a lot of really amazing speakers, and we're really gearing up for an amazing season. This is the first event of this year in through the spring. We've had Dennis McKenna here. We've had Neil deGrasse Tyson. We have a lot of really exciting speakers on the horizon. We're very excited to have Graham here tonight. So I want to introduce Graham. You may know Graham as a best-selling author, journalist, an unconventional thinker who raises questions about humanity's past. Graham's books include Fingerprint of the Gods, The Sign and the Seal, Supernatural, and Entangled, and have been translated in 27 languages and have sold millions of copies worldwide. Now, on a personal note, I read Supernatural in 2006, almost 8 years ago, before leaving for an 8-month journey through South America. And what I learned from Graham through that book about shamanic practices and plant medicines opened me up to possibilities that I had absolutely didn't have any idea existed. And eventually led me to this life-changing experience that I had in the Bolivian Amazon that forever changed who I am as a person. And I know that I'm not alone, and there are millions of other people out there just like me. And on behalf of all of us, I would just like to say thank you, Graham. So tonight, Graham is going to give 2 lectures. First, he's going to introduce his new book, War God, and some of the research around that. And shortly after, Graham is going to explore consciousness with us through the lens of Upper Paleolithic cave art through modern-day shamanism. And we're very excited to hear Graham's perspective about the ongoing war on terror, on consciousness, and his views on the censorship that was early imposed this year by the TED Science Board. And without further ado, I'd like to present to you Graham Hancock.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed all for being here this evening. I'm thrilled to see you all here. And thank you to Dave and Rob and to the National Arts Club for making this event happen. And most of all, I want to thank my wife, Santha. Santha, please. Who is very shy. Every adventure Santha and I have shared for the past 22 years. She's a photographer. She's a diver. We've climbed to the top of the Great Pyramid together. We've been at the bottom of the oceans together. And I would not be here if it were not for Santha. So I want to thank her. As Dave mentioned, I'm going to give 2 talks this evening. The first talk is short. It's about half an hour. And this is to introduce my... I'm known as a non-fiction author, but I am going against the trend of publishing who like to keep me in my box, and I'm writing some occasional works of fiction. And my new book is a novel, and it's called War God, and it's about the Spanish conquest of Mexico. I'm grateful to anybody who supports my work by buying this novel. I know that I'm stepping out of line by writing it, but there are some ideas that can only be explored in fiction, and this is one of those. After that, I'm going to go straight on to the talk on consciousness, and I will address some of the issues from my controversial problems with TED earlier this year. And I hope afterwards there'll be time for questions and answers, to sign books. If anybody wants books signed, I'm very happy to take pictures and do just anything at all, because I'm really grateful to all of you for being here, and I would not be anywhere in this world without my readers, and that's truly and deeply felt. So my novel, War God, is about the Spanish conquest of Mexico. The Spanish conquest of Mexico unfolded between 1519 and 1521. And this is the area in which the story is set. This is, of course, Mexico, and here is the Aztec Empire. I will refer to them as the Aztecs, but they are properly known as the Mexica, and it's from that name that we get the modern name of Mexico. But they're most commonly known in general parlance as the Aztecs. And in 1519, when Cortés turned up on the coast of Mexico, they commanded a very large empire, and the heart of that empire was the city of Tenochtitlan, which we know as Mexico City today. One could not recognize ancient Tenochtitlan in modern Mexico City because in those days it was a lake. And Tenochtitlan was situated on an island in the heart of the lake, and that island was approached along causeways, which in some cases were as much as 6 miles in length. When the Spaniards first saw these causeways and the stunning works of engineering that they represented, they were filled with fear and concern that they might not be able to defeat the people who had made this. And furthermore, the Aztecs were a militaristic empire. There is a number of ways in which they were similar to the Spanish. They had knights in armor. They had eagle knights who wore the totem of the eagle, and jaguar knights. They were trained in martial arts from a very early age. There was something, in some ways, splendid and noble about them. But I do not want to whitewash the Aztecs. On my reading, and I've done a great deal of research into this subject before I wrote the novel, in my reading of this story, we have to accept that these were an unbelievably brutal and cruel people. That in a sense the doom that was brought upon them was of their own making. They practiced human sacrifice on a grand scale, and sitting at the head of this empire of terror was the man known these days as Montezuma, more correctly called Moctezuma, who even to look him in the eyes was to face immediate death. There was no compromise with Moctezuma and with the Aztec Empire. This pyramid dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, this is why my novel is called War God, was dedicated in the 1480s, about 40 years before the Spanish conquest of Mexico. And when it was dedicated, according to the accounts of the time, 80,000 people were sacrificed in honor of the deity. The queues of sacrificial victims stretched back several miles in 4 directions, and teams of killers worked at the top of the pyramid to cut out the hearts of the men and women who were offered for sacrifice. The Aztecs appear to have taken some pleasure in these acts of human sacrifice. I'm sorry to offer these brutal images, but they are part of what I had to understand when I came to write this novel. The victim was marched up the pyramid, and his or her heart was cut out with a flint knife or an obsidian knife. The Aztecs were a Stone Age culture. They had no metal weapons, and this was one of the reasons that the Spanish had advantages over them. Typically, the head of the victim would be cut off and placed on a skull rack in the temple of the war god. The Aztecs were cannibals, and they favored the thigh meat of the victim cooked with chilies and beans. As to the torso and other parts of the victim, these were fed to the animals in Moctezuma's zoo. So this is a truly grotesque and terrifying situation, and it's on record as a historical fact that the Aztecs fattened their victims before sacrificing them. So there were such places as fattening pens, where the victims would be constrained, sometimes for several months, and prepared for sacrifice so that they would in some way be delicious to the god. And when we see the Aztec images of this deity, the war god Huitzilopochtli, he seems fearsome and dreadful, and we can see images in which buckets of blood are being poured over him, and the body parts of the victims are being eaten. So I think there's no getting away from it. This was an extremely brutal and terrifying culture that ruled over the Valley of Mexico in 1519. I'm a great fan of psychedelics, but But let's not glamorize psychedelics either. Psychedelics can have their dark side. It depends, I think, what you bring to the visionary plants. And what the Aztecs brought to their consumption of psilocybin mushrooms was horrific and dark, and these mushrooms were used in the rituals of human sacrifice. And again, it's on record that Moctezuma used to communicate regularly with the war god, with Hummingbird, because that's what Huitzilopochtli means, in visionary trances. And as far as I can see, he was consistently given incredibly bad advice by Hummingbird. Which led him to acts of often of the utmost horror. It's been a theme of my work for a long time, and some people object to this, that we live in what a friend of mine, James Tiburon, calls a university of duality. I'm not saying that duality is all there is. I think there is a oneness beyond duality. But we appear to be here to learn from duality and from the choices for right or wrong, for good or evil that are offered to us in this human life. And it's a tragic fact that some societies choose evil. Nazi Germany, of course, in World War II was the classic example. And in many ways, the Aztecs were the Nazis of Central America in the 16th century. I tell the story through the eyes of a number of individual characters, actually about 10 characters, but two of them in particular are dear to my heart and important to me. And one of them is a true historical figure, and her name is Malinal. She became the mistress of Cortés, and she became Cortés's interpreter. He does not give her as much credit as she deserves in his writings, but at one point he does state very clearly that aside from God himself, it was Malinal who gave me this conquest of Mexico. In other words, he would not have conquered Mexico if this woman had not stood by his side. And therefore, her motives are of the greatest interest. And when we meet Malinal in history, it was very clear to me from studying the sources that she already had a huge grudge against Moctezuma. It's just not clear why. And that she intended to use Cortés as her instrument to bring Moctezuma down, which ultimately she did, and very successfully. The other young woman character whose eyes I tell the story through is a witch, Tozi. She's only 14 years old in this story, and she's not fully entered into her powers. And we meet her and Malinal in the fattening pen at the foot of the Great Pyramid, awaiting sacrifice at the hands of Moctezuma. I always say thank goodness for Google Images, because there's how I'd like Tozi to look, and this is a modern image of Malinal, who, as I say, is a true historical character. There they are at the foot of the Great Pyramid, and just to give away a little of the plot there, marched up the pyramid to be sacrificed by Moctezuma himself. But there is a supernatural intervention. And paradoxically, that intervention comes from the war god, from Huitzilopochtli, from this hummingbird character who orders Moctezuma to release them. And Tozi stays in Mexico City, in Tenochtitlan, to work supernatural harm against Moctezuma. And Malinal goes to the coast. And the reason that Malinal goes to the coast, which is in truth where she enters history, has to do with the story of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the deity who's spoken of as white-skinned and bearded in many of the ancient traditions of Mexico, who was said in ancient times to have been driven out by a consortium of evil deities, but who would one day return to reimpose peace, to abolish human sacrifice, and to institute a situation in which the only sacrifices would be of fruits and flowers. Now, the Spanish had been in Cuba and Hispaniola. Hispaniola is what we call Haiti and the Dominican Republic today. They'd been in Cuba and Hispaniola since 1492, and they were aware of this mainland, but they were not quite ready to take it on. They had been building up their forces in the islands, and there had been one or two small exploratory expeditions, and the Aztecs were aware that something odd was going on, that white-skinned, bearded people with seemingly godlike attributes had been witnessed off the coasts of Mexico. And there was a thought that this might be to do with the return of Quetzalcoatl. But what was really eerie about it was that in the Mexica way of things, it was prophesied that Quetzalcoatl would return in the year one reed. And it just so happened that 1519, the year that Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico, was the year one reed in the Aztec calendar. So there was a sense of the fulfillment of prophecy in his coming, and this is why I have Marinal go to the coast, where indeed she enters history, to encounter him. Now the Spanish, if anything, were worse than the Aztecs. I have painted a negative picture of the Aztecs, and I honestly think they deserve it, but the Spanish were absolute horrors, and they had carried out a complete genocide of the indigenous peoples of Cuba and Haiti, the Taino Indians. Where there was resistance, they simply strung people up over slow fires and burnt them to death. The brains of infants were dashed out against houses, and the Spanish liked to feed people to dogs. That's where we get the phrase throwing men to the dogs from. And they would use Taino Indians as subjects to test out the edges of their weapons, just to hack off an arm or a head here and see how the Toledo steel worked. So they were absolutely and utterly brutal people, and they'd been fighting for 700 years the Reconquista of Spain against the Moors, and so they were driven by a kind of religious fury and passion, and they were deeply inured to war, and therefore they were utterly deadly as a military force, and they believed that they were doing all of this for God. Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, in 1492, had drawn a line of longitude down the map and had given everything east of that line of longitude to Portugal and everything west of it to Spain. That's why they still speak Portuguese in Brazil today. And it's why they speak Spanish in Mexico. Mexico fell within the Spanish sphere of influence. And in 1513, this document, the Requerimiento, was promulgated. And the purpose of the Requerimiento, the Spanish were rather legalistic, if brutal, and they believed that, that they should do things in a legal way. So they were told to read this document to any indigenous peoples that they intended to fight. And the document would be read in Spanish or Latin, which of course nobody could understand, but that was not considered to matter. If you do not surrender, I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them. And we shall take away your goods and shall do you all the mischief and damage that we can. And we protest that the deaths and losses which shall accrue from this are your fault. This was the character of the Spaniards in this time. Of course, it was all really about gold. The Spanish greed, the Spanish lust for gold, that ailment of the heart, as Cortés put it, for which the only remedy is gold, which led the Spanish to these acts of rapine and cruelty. Cortés himself, Hernán Cortés, the leader of this tiny Spanish expedition, 11 ships, 490 men, was a brilliant Machiavellian player, undoubtedly a man of great courage, a risk taker, a chancer, and a very clever man in many ways, but utterly without scruple. His lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, a complete psychopath, a brilliant swordsman, extremely handsome, a womanizer, and caused so much trouble to Cortés down through the conquest. But Cortés kept on forgiving him. He felt that he owed something to Alvarado. Diego de Velázquez was the governor of Cuba, made the mistake of appointing Cortés as the captain general of the fleet that would sail to Mexico, changed his mind at the last minute and tried to relieve Cortés from command, but Cortés got wind of this and sailed the fleet in the night before Velázquez could arrest him. I'm cutting through a few historical details here, but the fleet sailed in a storm and in due course landed on the island of Cozumel, a holiday resort today. But there the Spanish encountered a gentle faction of the Mayan people, because of course the whole of the Yucatan was populated by the Maya. and we see these images of the Spanish landing on Cozumel, where they faced no resistance, and fell into an incredible piece of luck in the form of this Spaniard called Jerónimo de Aguilar. Cortés was told through sign language, because he couldn't speak to the Maya, that there was somebody who looked like him living on the mainland. And indeed, that person was a Castilian, which is what the Spanish called themselves. So he understood that there was a shipwrecked Spaniard somewhere on the mainland of Mexico. Indeed, that was the case. And he grabbed Jerónimo de Aguilar, who turned out to be one of 26 Spaniards who'd been shipwrecked on the Yucatan. 25 of them had been eaten by the Maya, and Aguilar had survived. He'd been there for 11 years. He spoke fluent Maya and fluent Spanish, and he became the first interpreter for Cortés. The Spanish sailed on from Cozumel to the Tabasco River, where Cortés intended to inflict punishment upon the Chontal Maya, who had the year before conducted an engagement against a small Spanish fleet of 3 ships in which 70 Spaniards had been killed. Cortés wanted to take revenge for this. One of the things that interests me about this story is its supernatural elements. Cortés felt himself to be guided by Saint Peter. Ever since his childhood, when it was felt that an intervention by St. Peter had saved his life in a dreadful fever, he felt that St. Peter was his spiritual guide. What I'm suggesting is that the same demon who appears to Moctezuma as Hummingbird, the war god, took on another disguise and appeared to Cortés as St. Peter. And the purpose of demons throughout human history has been to drive human beings into acts of wickedness and evil, and that was what these demonic encounters with these 2 leaders did. So effectively, the Cortés and Moctezuma are being played like puppets by the same demon to maximize human misery in Mexico and in the world. The Spanish went upriver on small boats at Potonchan on the Tabasco River. They encountered a superior Mayan force of estimated, in the accounts of the time, at 40,000 men. This is 40,000 against 490. The odds seem insuperable. But like the Aztecs, the Maya were a Stone Age culture, and the Spanish had a number of advantages. They had their Toledo steel weapons. They had guns. They had a primitive form of musket called the arquebus. They had cannon, falconets, and lombards. And they had their dogs of war, 100 with the Spanish fleet. These dogs of war were trained to relish human flesh, and they were armored with steel, with mail or steel plate. Now, the Maya and the Aztecs did have dogs. They had Chihuahuas. And these Chihuahuas were reared as a food item, and they didn't even know how to bark. So confronted by these mastiffs and wolfhounds and lurchers trained to relish human flesh was a very terrifying situation. And they were thought to be dragons or some sort of supernatural beast at first. It was not understood what they were, and weapons just bounced off their armor. The other huge advantage was cavalry. This is somewhat exaggerated in the painting. The Spanish actually had 16 heavy horse with them. But what we have to understand is that there had never been a cavalry charge in the Americas. Horses had been extinct for 12,000 years. European infantry had developed techniques for dealing with cavalry. Those techniques did not exist amongst the Maya or the Aztecs. So what really broke this battle was when Cortés, at the head of his 16 cavalry, came down at 30 miles an hour with the ground thundering beneath their hooves and hit the Mayan forces with a gigantic shock. And what should have been a complete defeat for the Spaniards turned into a rout for the Maya. And at the end of that rout, the Maya surrendered. And this is where Malinal, my heroine, enters history, because she was amongst 20 women who were given to Cortés as a peace offering by the Maya. And initially, it's clear that Cortés did not realize what an incredible gift he had received in the form of Malinal, because he actually handed her over as a bed slave to one of his lieutenants, a man called Puerto Carrero, much to Malinal's annoyance, since Cortés was her objective from the very beginning. but she was soon to prove her worth. The Spanish sailed on, and they made their first contact with the Aztecs at a place called Tenochtitlan. And there they met the Aztec ambassadors, and Aguilar, the translator, the interpreter who spoke Maya and Spanish, suddenly became useless. He couldn't speak Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. And Cortés was again reduced to sign language. And for Cortés, language was everything. He used language to dominate his enemies. And he found himself at a grave disadvantage. And that's when Malinal thrusts herself forward and steps into the pages of history, because she spoke fluent Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and Maya. She spoke both those languages, and she knew what she could do. And she made it clear to Cortés she could work with Aguilar. Look, I will put the words of the Aztec ambassadors into the Mayan language, and Aguilar can then take them from Mayan and put them into Spanish. And in reverse, this way you can speak to them. Within weeks, she was a brilliant woman. She had dispensed with Aguilar entirely. She mastered Spanish and became Cortés's sole interpreter. And indeed, in due course, became his mistress and the mother of their child, Martin Cortés. And this statue of them stands in a neglected corner of Mexico City. There we see the family of Cortés and Malinal and their son, Martin. There have been many images of Malinal throughout history, some of them romantic, but today she is a figure of hatred in Mexico. She is seen as a traitor. Indeed, if you want to insult somebody in Mexico, call them a malinchist, because that is how she's understood to be, as the woman who handed over her country to the invaders. I hope that my novel has gone some way to restore the reputation of this remarkable and undoubtedly courageous woman who was in the heat and the heart of every battle that the Spanish fought. I think that she was motivated by a desire to overthrow that empire of terror headed by Moctezuma. And as I said at the beginning, that she saw Cortés as the instrument that she would use. She very quickly understood that he was not a god. But she gave him the psychological information he needed to defeat Moctezuma. And everywhere we see images of Cortés, we see Malinal by his side, and always she has the glyph for speech in front of her mouth. She became the tongue of Cortés. And it was she who told him of the ancient traditions of white-skinned, bearded strangers associated with the god Quetzalcoatl, whose return was predicted in the year one read, the very year that Cortés turned up. And in case one wants to imagine that these traditions were the invention of the friars for propagandistic reasons, one need only go to La Venta or Monte Alban, where the images in the oldest archaeological strata of Mexico, the images of mysterious strangers are indeed very clear to see, and always associated with the imagery of the feathered serpent of Quetzalcoatl, and of his return in the year one read, when it was prophesied that he would come in a boat that moved by itself without paddles, and that he would overthrow a wicked king. And Moctezuma placed himself in that role of the wicked king who was to be overthrown. There was a faction amongst the Spaniards who wanted to desert and go back to Cuba, about 100 out of the 490 men. Cortés solved the problem by sinking his entire fleet. He drilled holes through the bottoms of the boats and told the men it was some kind of woodworm, and said to them, basically, you will either conquer or die. And off they marched into the highlands, and they were heading for this place, Tlaxcala. And they were going there because there was a small independent country there called Tlaxcala, who had been fighting the Aztecs for 200 years. The Aztecs had used the Tlaxcalans as a farm for human sacrifice. And the Tlaxcalans had refused to bow to the superior power of the Aztecs and had fought them bravely and vigorously for 2 centuries, maintaining their independence. So Cortés naturally thought that the Tlaxcalans would make perfect allies for him, a militaristic people who hated the Aztecs. Of course, they would join him to fight the Aztecs. And he was heading for this man, Xicotenca the Younger, who is a key figure in my story. But Xicotenca was a very far-sighted man, and truly a hero. He knew that Cortés wouldn't stop with the Aztecs. He knew that Cortés would destroy the whole culture of Mexico. And so even though it was in his interests to join Cortés, he fought Cortés tooth and nail for the best part of 2 months, and really caused the Spanish an enormous amount of trouble with ambushes and attacks. There's a famous case where one Tlaxcalan warrior, with his wooden sword edged with obsidian blades, actually beheaded a Spanish horse with a single blow, ending the supernatural idea of the horse, because the horses, as I said, had not been seen before, and they were initially thought to be part animal, part deer, part man, supernatural beings. The Tlaxcalans punctured that myth very rapidly. But as the Spanish were hard-pressed, Cortés resorted to terrorism. Whole villages were massacred, men and women were thrown into pits on top of sharpened stakes, and eventually the elders of Tlaxcala forced Xicotenca the Younger to surrender to Cortés. And he became, at that point, Cortés's chief lieutenant. He accepted to work with Cortés. But it's a sign of the character of the man. 2 years later, in the final apocalyptic fall of Tenochtitlan, when the Aztecs were placed under the most horrendous pressure, starving, dying of thirst, and suffering from a dreadful smallpox epidemic deliberately introduced by the Spaniards, that Xicotenca went to Cortés and told him in no uncertain terms, you have to stop. You've punished these people enough. You've made your point. Back off. And Cortés refused. He said, I'm going to wipe them out to the last man. And at that point, Xicotenca walked out. Cortés sent a team after him, captured him, and hanged him from a tree. This is, again, an indication of the character of these players. From Tlaxcala, the Spanish moved on to Cholula, fascinating city in Mexico today. An air of sadness hangs over it, because there the Spaniards carried out a massacre of 5,000 people deliberately to send a message to Moctezuma. And those who were captured were fed to the dogs. There are images of these horrendous events in the museum at Cholula to this day. So when Cortés arrived on the shores of Lake Texcoco, he came wrapped in the aura of a god, and not a god of peace, but a god of war. And Moctezuma was, by that stage, terrified of him, like all bullies, and Moctezuma was a huge bully. He didn't take very well to being bullied himself, and he was really quite spineless. There's an interesting description of the encounter on the causeway when Cortés and Moctezuma meet one another, with Malinal interpreting. And what the Aztec scribes speak of is the way that Malinal looked Moctezuma straight in the eye during that encounter and never lowered her eyes for a second. And again, I think this tells me something about the character of the woman who's the heroine of my story. The idea amongst the Aztecs was they'd let the Spanish in, not their Tlaxcalan allies, just the 490 Spaniards. Once they were inside the city, they would cut the bridges on the causeway, and they would fall upon the Spaniards and massacre them with their superior numbers. Cortés solved this problem by taking Moctezuma hostage within days of arriving in Mexico City. And actually 6 months of peace followed. And Cortés might have got away with an almost bloodless coup were it not for his rival Diego de Velázquez, the governor of Cuba. By then, one ship had gone back and forward from Cuba to Mexico, and he'd heard of Cortés's success, and he couldn't bear it. He was jealous. Cortés had to divide his force. He kept 100 men in Mexico City, keeping Moctezuma captive. He sent 300 men to the coast, and amazingly, he managed to defeat this much larger Spanish force, absorbed the 1,000 men into his army, and headed back to Mexico City. But there, his psychopathic lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, had, I mean, you can't make this stuff up, honestly. Why would anybody write nonfiction about this when the facts are just so crazy? You know, Alvarado has conducted a massacre in Mexico City, and finally the Aztecs have risen, and they are fury. He's stirred up a hornet's nest, and a huge battle is going on, and a new leader comes to the fore, Cuauhtemoc, and the Spanish are put under enormous pressure. Cortés makes a forced march from the coast. He breaks into Mexico City. He relieves the siege. He puts Moctezuma up on the battlements to appeal for peace, and the Aztecs kill Moctezuma with stones and arrows. And then 4 days of horrendous fighting follow. and the Spanish really are in huge risk of their lives. 50 of them are marched up the pyramid and sacrificed in front of their colleagues. They also sacrificed the horses, by the way, and put the heads on the skull rack alongside the heads of the Spaniards. And finally, the Spaniards flee the city. Remember, there's about 1,000 of them now. They flee the city along the causeways. The causeways have been cut. The Aztecs control the lake from canoes. This is called the Noche Triste, excuse my Spanish, the sad night. And in fact, 600 Spaniards lose their lives that night in the fighting. They get out by going across the heaped up bodies of the dead in these gaps in the causeways. 400 of them reach the edge of the causeway. At that point, if the Aztecs had had any sense, they would have wiped out those 400 Spaniards, but they didn't. They were too busy sacrificing people on the pyramid, and they let them go. And off they went to Tlaxcala, and there Cortés licked his wounds. He was very severely injured in this fighting, and the iron clearly enters into his soul at this time, and he will show no mercy to the Aztecs from then on. 6 months later, he's back. He marches around the lake. One by one, he picks off all the Aztec allies, isolating the Aztecs on their island. But they feel they're impregnable there. They cannot be taken in their island refuge. But this is where Cortés does something that's on the scale of, I don't know, Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. Up in the mountains of Tlaxcala, 100 miles from Mexico City, he builds an entire fleet of boats, 13 brigantines. These are ships that will each carry 50 men. He tests them out on a lake in the mountains. They work. He dismantles them, puts them on the backs of 8,000 bearers, and has them carried down to the shores of Lake Texcoco, where they're rebuilt, and then cannon are mounted upon them, and then begins the siege of Tenochtitlan. And truly, it is an apocalyptic siege. This is when the Spanish deliberately introduced smallpox on infected blankets. There is no resistance. A huge epidemic spreads through the city. The people are starving, dying of thirst because the waters of the lake are salt and the aqueducts have been cut. Again, Cortés breaks in. 2 more days of horrendous fighting follow. And finally, the end comes. And there are, although the Aztecs were brutal, they wrote beautiful, beautiful poetry. And there's a wonderful poem called Broken Spears, which describes how the spears and shields of their young men could no longer protect or save their city from the onslaught that was turned against them. And what interests me about all of this is, in a way, it seems that the demon has won. You know, this was a turning point in human history. It was a turning point. If the Spanish conquest of Mexico had gone a different way, the whole history of the world we live in today would be different. Imagine for a moment if those two cultures had met one another in a spirit of love and a spirit of mutual learning. How much the Spaniards had to learn from the peoples of the Americas. How much the peoples of the Americas had to learn from Europe. What an incredible exchange could have taken place, and what a flowering. You know, this idea of the return of Quetzalcoatl, which is a very beautiful idea, it could have happened. It could have happened. The world could have gone down a beautiful path at that point. And it seems to me that one of the reasons it did not do so is something that we should not ignore, is that there is more to reality than meets the eye, and that we are immersed in this invisible realm. And that angels and demons on both call to us, and humans make choices, and they made a terrible choice in this situation. If Moctezuma had not been busy sacrificing his neighbors would not have turned against him. They could have met the Spaniards on the coast and turned them back right there and then. The Spanish conquest of Peru would not have followed. The annihilation of the Native American peoples of North America, I don't believe it would have happened in the way that it did. Everything could have been different, but it was not. You know, the population of Mexico was 30 million on the eve of the conquest. Less than 50 years later, it had been reduced to just 1 million people. 29 million person genocide took place right there and right then. And what redeems the story for me is the ordinary people who lived through this terrible time. And what I'm trying to show in this book is that there is something in the human spirit, a capacity for love, a capacity for courage, a capacity for decency that can prevail in the darkest of times, that people do make the right choices even when everything is going terribly wrong. And there were good people amongst the Spaniards, like Bernal Diaz and Gonzalo de Sandoval, Xicotenca, the Tlaxcalan hero, Tosi, and Malinal. It's them who redeemed the story for me. So that's really the background to my novel. In fact, the series of novels that is War God. The first book is available now. I was never able to find a mainstream publisher in America, but the book is available on Amazon. And I believe it can now be ordered from bookstores, but it would probably take 6 or 8 weeks to turn up in a bookstore.